Standing on a windswept plateau in the Peruvian Andes, the scene feels, desolate. Snow whips across the mountains. The air is so thin you can barely catch your breath, and honestly, temperatures plunge far below freezing. It looks like the last place on Earth where you'd expect a mining empire to rise. Yet, hidden beneath this hostile land lies one of the richest copper deposits on the planet, a mine so massive it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But for decades, it earned another name, the Hell Mine. Every company that tried to tame it had failed. The altitude made workers sick, machinery froze solid, storms cut off entire camps, and transportation was nearly impossible. Canadian and Swiss mining giants poured in money, only to watch it vanish in disaster. They eventually abandoned the site, swearing it could never be developed. To the global mining industry, this was not an opportunity. It was a graveyard. So when China stepped forward in 2013 and spent $7 billion to buy this cursed project, the world was, well, stunned. Why would any nation gamble so much on something everyone else had already written off? Critics sneered that China had just purchased the most expensive mistake in mining history. Western analysts laughed, predicting the project would collapse in less than 5 years. But 10 years later, those same voices aren't laughing anymore. They're watching in silence. And some are even admitting envy. So what happened? How did China take what the world called unminable and turn it into one of its biggest strategic wins? The site, known as Las Bambas, sits more than 4,000 meters above sea level in the Andes. At that height, oxygen levels are only about 60% of what you'd find at sea level. Workers struggle with pounding headaches and breathlessness after even small movements. Snowstorms hit over 200 days a year, blocking access roads and freezing equipment solid. Transporting heavy machinery is a nightmare. Every piece has to be dismantled and carried up twisting mountain roads, tripling the cost. Back in 2013, Swiss mining giant Glencore tried hauling a massive crusher into the site. It slipped off a cliff. The loss was more than $50 million gone in seconds. And that was only one disaster in a long list. Even worse, the mine sits in a protected watershed that feeds into the Amazon River. Environmental rules are strict wastewater can contain no more than 0.1 milligrams of copper ions per liter, 150 times stricter than even drinking water standards. When a Canadian company tried operating here in 2009, they failed the environmental requirements, destroyed parts of the local ecosystem, and were slapped with a $20 million fine before being kicked out. Mining giants around the world eventually reached the same conclusion. The risk wasn't worth it. The Hell Mine was untouchable. So why did China spend billions buying it? On the surface, it looked insane. But behind the decision was a cold, calculated strategy. China is the world's manufacturing powerhouse, and copper is honestly one of the lifeblood metals of modern industry. Everything from construction and electronics to electric cars and renewable energy relies on it. Yet despite its huge landmass, China only holds about 4% of the world's copper reserves. That meant most of its supply had to be imported, primarily from Latin America, and that dependence came with serious risks. In 2014, a strike at Chile's state-owned copper company caused prices inside China to spike 5% in a single day. It was a warning shot. If other countries controlled the copper supply, China's entire industrial base could be strangled. The stakes got even higher with the rise of clean energy. An electric vehicle requires up to 4 times as much copper as a traditional gas-powered car. Solar power plants, wind turbines, and massive battery grids all consume extraordinary amounts of it. Without reliable access to copper, China's dream of dominating the new energy future would be impossible. That's why the Hell Mine, with its enormous 10 million tons of proven copper reserves, suddenly became irresistible. To outsiders, it looked like a death trap. To China, it looked like the key to industrial security. The takeover wasn't easy. From the moment China's engineering teams arrived, they faced everything nature could throw at them. For 3 straight months, sandstorms forced workers to wear gas masks just to stand upright. Landslides swallowed newly built roads, leaving dozens of workers stranded in the mountains. Frequent earthquakes forced the main tunnels to be rebuilt 3 separate times, each costing hundreds of millions of yuan. And the altitude itself broke equipment designed for normal conditions. Engines failed, electronics shorted out, and even heavy trucks couldn't function. Instead of giving up, Chinese engineers partnered with research institutions back home to design brand new machinery, equipment tough enough for thin air, extreme cold, and relentless radiation. To tackle the transportation problem, they mapped the terrain with drones and carved a 4-lane highway straight through sheer cliffs. For worker safety, they equipped every miner with smart helmets that tracked heart rates and oxygen levels in real time. And then came the boldest move: automation. China built a remote control center in Lima, connected by 5G networks. From hundreds of kilometers away, engineers could now direct drilling, blasting, and even excavators inside the mine. By the year 2020, nearly 80% of all operations were automated. The Hell Mine was no longer just a mine. It had become one of the world's first smart mines. But the challenges weren't only physical. In 2021, local protests shut down the mine for 50 days. Villagers feared that Chinese mining would pollute their water and destroy their land. Global copper prices spiked during the shutdown, proving just how important the mine had already become. Instead of crushing the protests, China shifted its approach. Companies poured money into the local community, 80 million yuan, to build a new bridge, cutting travel time by 4 hours. Funding for reforestation projects across hundreds of hectares. 600,000 trout released into rivers to restore ecosystems. Local training programs and jobs that paid triple the average wage. Gradually, the anger cooled. Young people in the surrounding towns began to see the mine not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Today, over 60% of them say they'd work at Las Bambas. A decade later, the gamble looks less like madness and more like a masterstroke. China has already mined 2.7 million tons of copper, worth around $27 billion at today's prices. With more than 10 million tons still underground, the total value could exceed $100 billion. The mine now ships 400,000 tons of copper concentrate every year from Peru's Matarani port directly to China, feeding smelters that supply electric vehicle factories and solar plants. For Peru, the impact has been just as dramatic. Local GDP has tripled since 2014, and tax revenues from the mine exceed $1.7 billion, about 5% of the country's entire budget. China didn't stop there. It invested $120 million upgrading Matarani port and $200 million into railway renovations, slashing transport costs by 80%. Plans are underway to build an on-site solar farm, aiming to power the mine entirely with renewable energy. What was once called the Hell Mine is now one of the most advanced, profitable, and sustainable copper operations in the world. When China bought Las Bambas, many saw it as reckless bravado, throwing billions into an impossible dream. But 10 years later, the results speak for themselves. What others abandoned, China transformed. What the world mocked, China turned into a strategic victory. And this raises a bigger question. If China can flip the so-called Mount Everest of mining into a cornerstone of its global resource strategy, what other impossible frontiers will it conquer next? Because the story of the Hell Mine isn't just about copper. It's about how far a nation is willing to go to secure its future. And if you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to hit subscribe, like, comment, and turn on notifications for more.